Intrinsic motivation is often seen as a summum of motivation. For example, there is a quote that says that choose a job that you love and you never have to work a day in your life. But, of course, not all jobs are only intrinsically motivating. Hence, sometimes you would add extrinsic motivation into the equation, such as when you grade students if they do a good job in learning, or when you pay somebody more when they have engaged in professional development. Yet, what happens if you add extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation? Would some Well, research showed that this might not necessarily be the case, and that adding extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation might lead to an undermining effect where intrinsic motivation decreases or may even disappear. DC examined this issue in his PhD and wrote this article about it. Actually, this article marked the start of what we now know as SDT. DC examined how intrinsic and extrinsic motivation combine. Particularly, he found that intrinsic motivation may decrease when we start rewarding people for an activity that they find already intrinsically motivating. This is particularly the case when the reward is monetary and less so when the reward is verbally, or in other words, when we reward people with giving them compliments. So what did DC do? He invited participants to his lab and divided them in two different groups, an experimental group and a control group. Participants were invited to work on a task involving puzzles. These puzzles are known to be intrinsically motivating. After a while, and participants thought they were ready with the first phase, they could take a break and they could either work further on the puzzles, read some magazines that were made available, or do nothing at all. They did this 3 times in a row. So first working on the puzzles and then having a break in which they could work further on the puzzles, read a magazine, or do nothing at all. Interestingly, in the second time, they were rewarded for working on the puzzles. The experimenter said like, hey, we have some money for this type of research. We can now, for this part, pay you $1 per puzzle that you solve. In the third condition, participants, or in the third time, participants were again told like, we ran out of money, we don't have any available for this part of the task, so no monetary reward is given anymore. This was in the experimental condition. In the control condition, participants also engaged 3 times in making puzzles and also after each time had a break. There was no monetary rewards whatsoever. So now please do take a break and consider how would you examine the undermining effect in this type of research? Which conditions should you compare? Here are the results. DC examined how long participants engaged with the puzzles during their free choice period or during their break. They were free to do whatever they wanted to do, so if they would engage in making more puzzles, DC assumed that this would be an indication of their intrinsic motivation. DC compared the experimental group with the control group, and thus he examined how long participants were still working on the puzzles during the break. Remember that in the experimental condition, participants were previously paid for every puzzle they had solved. To examine the undermining effect or to examine whether the undermining effect took place, DC compared the amount people still spent working on the puzzles in the first round of research compared to the third round of research, because this actually allows to compare how long people would still engage in making the puzzles only because they would be intrinsically motivated. In time 2, in the experimental condition, there was also extrinsic motivation. And DC concluded from these numbers that the undermining effect was there. He could see that in the experimental condition, after being paid, after being extrinsically rewarded for the intrinsically motivating task, participants spent considerably less time on engaging in the puzzle tasks compared to when they first engaged in it. And this difference was significantly different from the control condition where no rewards were given during the whole time. Stated differently, DC examined how long people worked on the puzzles, meaning how intrinsically motivated they were to work on the puzzles in the first time compared to the third time, while they had been rewarded financially in the second time. And he examined these numbers compared with how intrinsically motivation changed from the first time to the third time in the control condition. While in the experimental condition, people were considerably less long in the third round of time compared to the first, there was no such difference found in the control condition. And this is an example of how the undermining effect might work. DC not only examined the undermining effect in terms of extrinsic monetary rewards, but also examined what happens if you give people extrinsic motivation by motivating them verbally, meaning by giving them a compliment when they are working really well. And here are the results. Again, DC looked at how long people spent on the puzzles during their free choice period or during their break. And again, he compared the experimental condition with the control condition. Remember that in this experiment, in the experimental condition, participants were rewarded verbally and no longer monetary. So they didn't get hard dollars anymore to work on the puzzles, but they were given a compliment. To examine the undermining effect, again, DC compared time 3 with time 1, because these were the conditions in which only intrinsic motivation was present. If the undermining effect would hold true, then the intrinsic motivation in time 3 would be less than the intrinsic motivation in time 1. And here are the results. What do they show? Yes, there is a decrease in intrinsic motivation in the experimental condition, but also such a decrease, and even more such a decrease, became apparent in the control condition. So people started to get being a little bit bored by the tasks, apparently. Stated otherwise, results showed that when you reward people verbally, there seems to be a far less decrease in intrinsic motivation or no decrease in intrinsic motivation compared to in the control condition when no such rewards are apparent. DC's initial research spurred a whole lot of other studies too. After a while, so many studies were conducted that the researchers could do a meta-analysis, which is a quantitative summary of all the research that is available. Within their meta-analysis, DC and colleagues examined two different types of studies examining the undermining effect. Either intrinsic motivation was measured using a free choice behavior paradigm, as we just saw before, or with self-reported interest questionnaires. In terms of the free choice paradigm, participants were given the possibility to choose the intrinsically motivating tasks after finishing something else. So consider this similar to a student engaging in study work during the weekend or an employee finishing a particular task when they have some free time. If we combine all different types of rewards, then we can clearly see that rewarding somebody for an intrinsically motivating task might reduce the time spent on this task later on. Interestingly, there's a difference between the type of rewards, as we saw before. If you give people verbal rewards, their intrinsic motivation, as measured with the time they spend on the task afterwards, actually increases rather than decreases, as would be expected based on the undermining effect. However, if we give them tangible rewards, hard dollars, for example, but also a globe to help them with geography or other types of tangible rewards, and then we could clearly see an undermining effect. The undermining effect doesn't happen that much when rewards are given unexpectedly. So, for example, you did a really good job at work and unexpectedly your supervisor gives you promotion. That does undermine your intrinsic motivation then. However, if the reward is expected, the undermining effect does pop up. The degree to which the expected rewards decrease intrinsic motivation might also depend on why the reward was given. For task non-contingent, there is no reason or no relationship between the reward and the task. The undermining effect is not there. However, if we give people rewards because they engage in the task or they complete the task or they do well on the task, then they might subsequently spend less time on this task. So the undermining effect is very prominent in these cases. Similar results happen in the self-reported studies or studies that use self-reported questionnaires. If we look at verbal rewards, they rather have a positive effect, but tangible rewards have a negative effect on the degree to which people say they like the task afterwards. Unexpected rewards are not so problematic, but expected rewards are. especially when they are giving engagement contingent or completion contingent. So, what is the take home message of the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in SCT? Well, extrinsic motivation might have an undermining effect on intrinsic motivation, so decreasing people's available intrinsic motivation. However, this effect differs depends on the way people are extrinsically rewarded. When we talk about tangible rewards, such as hard dollars, a bonus, or getting a car if you have good grades as a student, well, this might undermine your motivation to study, and especially your intrinsic motivation to study. However, if you give verbal rewards, this might actually not have such an undermining effect or even increase intrinsic motivation.